our national gatherings, where ceremonies were conducted to invite the spirits of the children to join us and to witness all the work that is being done to find them and to bring their spirits home. Ceremonies for the chair and for the spirits of the children were done earlier this morning. Over the last 2 years, medicine, sacred items, and gifts were offered to the empty chair to honor the children. As you can see, the chair is no longer empty. I recognize and give thanks to the eagle spirit that has been with me as I did this sacred work, and say now for its love and for its guidance. I want to bring everyone's attention to the cradle boards on stage. These cradle boards are a collection of 260 cradle boards that date back to 1860 to the present day. They are cared for by cradle keepers, a group of 8 Indigenous women in Thunder Bay, Ontario. The cradle keepers believe that the cradles are at the heart of reconciliation, representing hope and life. And they serve to remind us why we are here today, for the children. At each national gathering, participants honored you, and I want to restate some of the things that they said. They said that you are like those plants that keep breaking through the cement. Nothing can keep you down. They said, you are the heroes amongst us. They said, you are sacred people, like eagles moving majestically, rising above the atrocities. They said, you are our warriors. You are blades of grass, beautiful, strong, and resilient. And we honor you, and we stand with you. Before I speak to the contents of the final report, I would like to show a video that captures our journey over the last 2 years. But before, I must let you know that the video, my words, and slides during my presentation may be upsetting for some because they contain content, including images relating to the deaths and forced disappearances of children. If you require immediate support, please connect with the health supports in the room that are here, or contact the supports that are available on the phone numbers that you'll see on the slides. If I could ask to show the video, please. Being in the residential school wasn't pretty.
My husband was 11 years in residential school. He never held my girls because he was too scared to break them. That's residential school. That is the impacts of it.
They tried to take our spirits away. They tried to take the Indian out of us.
I was kidnapped in broad daylight, right in front of my...
have been taken from us, and we want them back to make the world safe for the children we now have and the ones that are coming.
Le système, il est brisé, il est malhonnête, il n'est pas égal pour tout le monde. Qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire quand ça arrive des choses-là? Qu'est-ce qu'on peut...
So impactful and hurtful to think of children who would be given such disrespect in life and in death.
When you die, you should be buried, you should have a proper burial.
We had a distinct way to honor the people who left us. There were ceremonies, there were songs, and for the children at our schools that are in unmarked burials, they have yet to receive this.
You don't get to the point of religious equality, racial equality, unless you understand foundational inequality in Canada that is steeped in centuries of colonialism.
I'm in a room right now full of survivors who have been through unimaginable abuse and torment only because they were simply born Indigenous.
Like we were not human. The number one law is not to harm a child. And that's exactly what the government did.
Children disappeared at residential schools and other institutions, buried in unmarked graves, forgotten, erased. But they were not forgotten by their families, by their communities, by their people. We just survive but thrive.
We couldn't speak our language. We couldn't even use our name. I was given a number. I still remember my number, and that's how they called you, a number.
I was broken spirit since then. I didn't know who I was. I lost my culture, my spirituality, my beliefs, my value.
Some of the young girls, they would go missing for months on end. The priests and the nuns would hide those girls when they got pregnant. My mom and two of her cousins were responsible for wrapping those babies and burning them.
As a boy in that residential school, mission school, the burning of little babies being thrown in the furnace by two nuns, and the screaming.
A young woman was disciplined by the nuns and the children, and the man whipped her until she died.
The building was run by the heat from the big stove only in the furnace. There was a lot of babies that was burnt in there.
Some of us didn't know how to deal with our feelings. We didn't know where to go, what to do.
We have boys missing for 50 years.
Come forward. They chose to forget what has happened to them and not be a part of this. They don't want anything to do with it.
My mom attended residential school in Beauval Mission, La Planche. I'm the youngest of 11 children. The two oldest babies passed away. In her dying bed, my mother said, "Please look for him."
Right now in Iqaluit, we don't have the best cemetery. They didn't listen to our knowledge, and they put the cemetery in a bog. So all of our people right now are being buried in muck and swampy areas. So we're hoping that we can open up a traditional cemetery in Iqaluit so that our people aren't being buried in muck and swamps, and that we can be buried traditionally and with our personal effects.
It's time for Canada as a see it, sit with those unsettling feelings, and learn from it so it does not happen again. No more denying what our survivors have been saying for years. No more belittling what it was, because it was genocide.
We need to uphold justice for the Indian residential school. These individuals are still alive, and the laws and the policies created by the Canadian government hide their crimes. And in order for us to have justice, these people need to face justice with Canadian laws.
Orange Shirt Day and Every Child Matters was created to honor survivors and their families and to remember those that never made it home.
There's very few people that have that gift and that strength for your people who need a voice.
It's an honor and a privilege to announce the appointment of Kimberly Murray as Independent Special Interlocutor for Missing Children and Unmarked Graves and Burial Sites associated with Indian residential schools.
There are children buried on the grounds of Indian residential school. And we need to find them, and we need to know who they are.
We will survive, and we will.
Of the pain, the suffering, the loneliness that we went through.
We are all human beings. That's what we say in our language to everyone, no matter where you come from. We are all people. We are one nation in this land.
Any culture in the world, be proud of your own.
Survivor, to find our voices.
I can consider every one of the survivors a big miracle. No matter how much tragedy, you're just like a diamond, precious and can't be broken.
What we are carrying through life from the residential schools is a very heavy burden.
Let's put our minds and our hearts together and build a future for our children, a good future.
What we're suggesting is a formation of a team composed of forensic medical examiners, archaeologists, anthropologists, spiritual leaders working in tandem in order to identify the remains of those children who will be found. We have to take an active control over the processes under which.
Be assured that our work of reconciliation will continue into the next generation.
I look forward to working with you for the respect and dignity of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in life and in death. And I also look forward to saying the hard truths to this country together.
I want to close with this quote from DeAndre Thomas Hart. They scattered us almost like beads. And now we are picking ourselves up one by one. We are color sorting ourselves.
Happening from nation to nation. And youth, such as yourselves, are the ones that will be leading the way.
Don't let your fires go out. Don't lose your languages. Don't let the ceremonies die.
So in closing, I wanted to say in Creek, I boomi, which means don't give up.
Be strong as you continue to tell your truth. Be strong as you...
For all of the survivors, for our communities, for our families.
As you can see from the video, survivors and youth have been at the center of my work. And I ask that we always ensure their voices are heard. And just that I'm gonna tech people, could we get the comfort screen working? Thank you. The final report builds on my November 2022 progress update report and my June 2023 interim report. It includes an executive summary and the sites of truth, sites of conscience, unmarked burials, and mass graves of missing and disappeared Indigenous children in Canada, which is a history report that was released for download on July 3rd, 2024. It also includes upholding sacred obligations, reparations for missing and disappeared Indigenous children and unmarked burials in Canada, which is a 2-volume report that is based upon and includes information received from 6 national gatherings, meetings, written submissions, research, and attending at search sites and within communities. This part of the final report is divided into 4 key areas: activating and enforcing international obligations, finding truth, rematriating lands, and repatriating children, supporting Indigenous-led healing and countering settler amnesty. The mandate and terms of reference for my position directed me to identify areas of improvement in Canadian law and make recommendations for a new federal legal framework. Too often, governments do not implement recommendations. So I have opted to identify the legal, moral, and ethical obligations that must be met within an Indigenous-led reparation framework for truth, accountability, justice, and reconciliation. These obligations arise from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Indigenous laws, international human rights law, and Canadian constitutional law. The greatest and most important obligation that we all have is to the survivors. They must be honored and acknowledged for their courage, determination, and advocacy to raise public awareness about the truths of unmarked burials or ignored. Survivors continue to be at the forefront of holding the federal government accountable for these harms. They are the living witnesses to what happened in these institutions. The search and recovery work being done across the country is a complex truth-finding process. It fulfills a highly personal yet universal human need to know what happened to deceased loved ones and to mourn, bury, and memorialize them according to the laws, spiritual belief. To search for and recover the missing and disappeared children has revealed the complexity, the scale, and lengthy time frame required to complete this sacred work. The Canadian legal framework is currently not equipped to provide adequate protections to these sites of truth before, during, and after the searches and investigations are done. The burial sites that I personally examine include marked, unmarked, and mass graves on institutional sites, on other lands associated with institutions, and in registered municipal, church, and private cemeteries. I express my deepest respect to each family who allowed me to join them when, after so many years of searching, they were finally able to visit the burial place of their missing or disappeared loved one. I was so honored to walk with you, to join you in offering prayers, and to stand quietly beside you as you laid sacred items and flowers on Mother Earth where your little ones are buried, letting them know that you never forgot about them. May their spirits now rest in peace with the ancestors, knowing that they are loved and remembered. Throughout the mandate, I have carried in my heart all the children who were taken from their parents and communities by the federal government and placed in Indian residential schools and other institutions. Consistent with the TRC's findings, my investigations revealed frequent forced transfers from one institution to another. As such, I have interpreted the term missing children to include any child who has never returned home from a government or church-run institution, including those who are buried in unmarked graves in registered cemeteries. These children are characterized as missing in circumstances where their families and communities were never notified of the location of their burial. There are also children who were disappeared, as defined by international law, which I will speak to in more detail shortly. I first want to address the fact that despite the well-documented reality of thousands of Indigenous Canadians still find it hard to accept the fact that the federal government committed any wrongdoing. And unfortunately, a vocal group of denialists have mounted a concerted effort to attack the truths of survivors, Indigenous families, and communities, and claim that there are no missing or disappeared children and no unmarked or mass graves in this country. While it may be tempting for Canadians to believe a mythical and idolized version of national history, denying the painful truths of survivors and of the missing and disappeared children and their families is a barrier to advancing reconciliation. Collectively, Canadians can no longer be bystanders to reconciliation, be disrupted. All Canadians need to understand the full and accurate account of our national history that articulates and acknowledges the magnitude of harms and wrongdoing committed by the state and the churches. Healing can only begin with an acknowledgement that these painful truths are part of Canada's history. Contained in Sites of Truth, Sites of Conscience is the evidence of genocide and crimes against humanity that were perpetrated against the children, deaths of the children. The evidence shows how the federal government and the churches dehumanized the children in life and after death. I want to read a passage from the introduction of Sites of Truth, Sites of Conscience. The buildings, burial grounds, and cemeteries on the sites of former Indian residential schools are etched deeply in survivors' memories. Once places of silence and suffering, they are now sites of truth. Once places of brutal violence and genocide, they are now sites of conscience. Survivors can never forget the memories of trauma and death held in these sites. Now Canada and all Canadians must do so as well. A site of conscience holds truths about the past and memories of injustice that must be exposed, acknowledged, remembered, shared, and learned from so it can never happen again. When the children died, government and church officials often did not return the children to their families and communities for burial. They were buried instead in cemeteries at the institutions, often in unmarked and mass graves that were sometimes dug by the children. Many of these cemeteries and burial sites were neglected, abandoned, and left unprotected. Sites of Truth, Sites of Conscience focuses on the documented Indian residential school of these burial locations with the images of historical records that support the testimonies of survivors are included. Once Indian residential schools began to be closed, the government made no plans to protect or maintain the cemeteries. As a result, many cemeteries were abandoned, fell into disrepair, and became vulnerable to disturbances and desecration, which has effectively hidden the burials of the missing and disappeared children. Sites of Truth and Sites of Conscience also highlights how the Indian residential system intersected with many other institutions. Parents and communities were often not informed when their children were transferred from one Indian residential school to another, or to a hospital, to a TB sanatorium, a reformatory, or when the children fell ill or died in one of these other institutions. I want to now speak about three main key findings in the Upholding Sacred Obligations report. First, that many of the missing children have in fact been disappeared by the state. Second, that there is an urgent need to establish a commission of investigations into the enforced disappearance of Indigenous children in Canada. And third, there is settler amnesty in Canada and a culture of impunity. Moving first to enforced disappearances. There is an important distinction between the terms missing and disappeared. While both refer to the absence of a person, being disappeared specifically requires the absence to be as a result of force against the will of a person. The term missing may be accurate in a literal sense and properly describes the longing of families for their loved ones. It fails, however, to reflect the government's culpability and responsibility for the fact that children died and went missing, not because of the children's choices or actions, but because of purposeful state violence, action, and force. These children did not just vanish. They were not disappeared by accident. The forced removal and transfer of Indigenous children was Canadian law and Canadian policy. Those in charge of these institutions knew that the children's chances of surviving were low. They exposed the children to diseases that killed them, refused to provide them with enough food, and permitted non-consensual human experimentation to be conducted on them. Pursuant to international legal criteria, the enforced disappearance of children requires the government to ensure that full investigations into the deaths of the children occur, that families and communities be notified of the fate of the children, and that reparations be provided. The enforced disappearance of persons is a violation of international human rights law. In 1992, the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, which led to the 2006 Convention on Enforced Disappearance. Enforced disappearances strike at the very core of human rights. They are an offense to human dignity and a violation of a person's right to not be subjected to torture or other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. They are also a violation to the right to liberty and security of the person. The international human rights violation of enforced disappearance consists of 3 elements. There must be a deprivation of liberty that the state authorized or supported, and there exists a refusal to acknowledge the disappearances, or there is a concealment of the fate or whereabouts of the disappeared person. This is exactly what happened to these children. Children were detained in Indian residential schools and other associated institutions, often without the consent of a parent or only with coerced consent. The federal government authorized the detention of the children and then disappeared them by failing to investigate the deaths and by failing to notify the families of their fate. Under international law, enforced disappearances are continuing offenses. They continue if the perpetrators conceal the fate and the whereabouts of the persons who have been disappeared. This means that as long as the fate of the children remain unknown, Canada and the churches are still committing the offense. In accordance with the UN standards, Canadian authorities have obligations to ensure prompt, thorough, and impartial investigations into all potentially unlawful deaths and disappearances. Investigations must respect the children's families and communities who have the right to know the truth about what happened to their disappeared loved ones. Because the Canadian state cannot investigate its own wrongdoing, Indigenous nations exercising their sovereignty are best placed to lead these investigations. But they need support, including support from an Indigenous-led and governed commission of investigations. Several countries across the world have established search and truth recovery mechanisms to investigate enforced disappearances. These offices or commissions of investigation can be created through legislation. They are mandated to investigate missing persons and enforced disappearances where the state or its agents are responsible for the disappearances. They are established to reveal the truth of what happened to the missing and disappeared as part of a reparations process, and often have significant powers, something that my office and the TRC did not have. Consistent with international human rights laws and principles, the right to truth is owed to Indigenous peoples. Canada has legal and moral obligations to ensure that a full investigation is conducted into the disappearances and deaths of these children. These investigations must not be led or constrained by the existing legal and death investigation systems that have harmed Indigenous people for over 100 years. A new mechanism must be created that meets international human rights principles, norms, and standards. Canada has an international obligation to establish a commission of investigation into missing and disappeared Indigenous children in unmarked burials. This commission of investigation should be created by legislation that upholds Indigenous sovereignty and laws and explicitly recognizes that survivors, Indigenous families and communities can freely choose whether to work with the Commission of Investigation or conduct their own independent investigations. This legislation must provide the Commission of Investigation with powers to compel the production of records, witness testimony, and any other information deemed relevant to its investigations. The legislation must also provide the Commission of Investigation with powers to secure and access sites for investigative purposes, including forensic investigations, and to coordinate approaches with domestic and international criminal law investigations. The federal government must provide the Commission of Investigation with stable, sustainable, and flexible funding for at least 20 years. In the past 2 years of my mandate, several concerns have been raised that require further investigation. Investigations into the deaths and disappearances of Indigenous children who were taken to Indian hospitals, TB sanatoria, and psychiatric institutions. Investigations into the deaths and disappearances of Indigenous children at other institutions, including orphanages, institutions for children with disabilities, homes for unwed mothers, reformatories, and the former juvenile detention centers. Investigations into the human experimentation that occurred on Indigenous people and children, and investigations into the deaths and disappearances of babies born, stolen, and killed at Indian residential schools and other associated institutions. I want to speak now about amnesty. We cannot forget that Indian residential schools were created and run by specific individuals. Atrocities and harms against Indigenous children, families, and communities were not carried out by abstract entities. They were carried out by people with faces, names, and professions. Specific clergy, nuns, physicians, researchers, policymakers, and politicians benefited financially and professionally from the suffering of Indigenous people. Almost without exception, they did so with complete impunity, shielded from accountability by the Canadian state. Only a small number of individuals that committed crimes against Indigenous children at Indian residential schools have been prosecuted, while none of those most responsible have been held to account at either the domestic or international level. Many perpetrators died long ago. The federal government and other institutions have worked harder to protect the perpetrators than they ever did to protect Indigenous children, families, and communities. The Canadian state has embraced a culture of settler amnesia and willful forgetting, a systemic impunity that is described in the final report as settler amnesty. Settler amnesty in Canada has several distinguishing and disturbing characteristics. Settler amnesty in Canada is a self-amnesty granted implicitly by the government to those most responsible for the crimes and human rights violations perpetrated against the children. It is a blanket amnesty, which, outside a small number of prosecutions, covers all individuals involved irrespective of their role, their seniority, and the responsibility for the crimes and the severity of the crimes committed. It is an unconditional amnesty. Those who have benefited from it have not had to accept responsibility or participate in any truth, justice, or accountability forum, and they did not have to request protection from prosecution. It is also a de facto amnesty. It has not been proclaimed or officially adopted, but rather is founded in the long-standing and active disinterest of the state to hold to account any of the people most responsible for the crimes committed. This type of settler amnesty results in a lack of accountability for past harms, impunity for those responsible for the human rights violations and mass atrocities, and a sense of systemic, strategic, state-endorsed amnesia. It has responded to the atrocity as if they did not occur, and to victims and survivors as if they do not exist. Settler amnesty in Canada for Indian residential school perpetrators was never legally proclaimed. It was a disguised amnesty implemented through the state's purposeful avoidance of investigations into the systemic harms that the children faced. The federal government has refused to adopt international or domestic laws or join human rights bodies that would have provided Indigenous victims and survivors with meaningful avenues of accountability. This is what Canada did. This is how Canada bubble wrapped itself from accountability. First, it had a significant role in ensuring that the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, that its treatment of Indigenous children and communities constituted genocide. Then, after ratifying the Convention on Genocide in 1952, Canada added genocide to its criminal code. But in doing so, it narrowed the definition of genocide than what is in the International Convention. Canada excluded 3 acts from the definition of genocide in Canada. First, it excluded the act of causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of a group. Second, it excluded the act of imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group. And finally, it excluded forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. None of these 3 acts are included in the definition of genocide in the Criminal Code of Canada. Yet all 3 crimes were perpetrated by the federal government when it created and operated the Indian residential school system. The next thing that Canada did to bubble wrap itself was to not include the international crimes of enforced disappearance and apartheid from the Rome Statute in its own Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act. To further protect itself, Canada has refused to sign or join several international human rights bodies that could help investigate human rights abuses against Indigenous children. Canada has not signed or ratified the American Convention on Human Rights, and it has not accepted the jurisdiction of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Canada has not signed or ratified the 2006 International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, which includes specific obligations for states to investigate disappearances and explicitly recognizes the right to truth. The federal government has also worked to protect perpetrators from prosecution and from having their names made public. For example, in formulating the TRC's mandate, the federal government and the church entities were insistent that the TRC be denied the power to issue subpoenas, make findings of criminal or civil liability, name names, or accuse individuals of misconduct. The federal government's strategy of settler amnesty continues unabated and manifests in various ways to deny, minimize, partially acknowledge, and limit the government's liability for harms caused to Indigenous children. The right to truth is a powerful potential antidote to the effect of the unconditional, blanket, de facto amnesty and the culture of impunity that the federal government has actively created and cultivated in Canada. It is time for Canada to shift from this culture of amnesty and impunity to a culture of accountability and justice. This starts with a proper Indigenous-led reparation framework. In meeting with survivors, Indigenous families, and communities over the past 2 years and gathering information about the substantive barriers they are facing in search and recovery work, it became apparent that a new legal framework requires more than minor tinkering with existing legislation. Of the many human rights violations inflicted on Indigenous children and their families, the disappearances and deaths of thousands of Indigenous children is the ultimate act of injustice that requires full reparations. A reparations framework in Canada must be developed through an anti-colonial lens that highlights the importance of Indigenous laws, international human rights, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Survivors and Indigenous communities have said that the Indigenous-led reparation framework must include the right to know the truth, and that Indigenous data sovereignty is vital to truth-finding. Settler colonial archives hold mass amounts of information that has remained inaccessible. Canada must amend existing laws and regulations governing access to archives and pass a new federal right to truth law and create, in consultation with Indigenous nations, a national Indigenous data sovereignty strategy. In order to protect the burial sites of the missing and disappeared children, reparations must be implemented that include the rematriation of the lands where the missing and disappeared children are buried. This would be consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and would ensure that Indigenous people are able to care for and protect the children who are buried on those lands. The current mechanisms to return land to Indigenous peoples were not designed to return land in the context of genocide and mass human rights violations. International law confirms that states have obligations both to the remains of the dead and to their living families and communities. International legal and human rights instruments call on governments to recognize and facilitate the right of repatriation. It was the policy and practice of the federal government and churches not to fund the repatriation of the children's bodies who died to their families and communities. Existing legislation is inadequate to support the repatriation of the missing and disappeared children. Indigenous families and communities have a right to the repatriation of their children under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. An Indigenous Repatriation Act is needed in Canada. Consistent with the UN Declaration, Canada also has international obligations to support Indigenous-led, resilience-based healing for those experiencing trauma during search and recovery processes and for the impact felt from the human rights atrocities. Apologies are also an important part of a reparation framework. Most of the apologies given to date fail to fully acknowledge the depth of harm suffered, and they do not establish an accurate public record of the injustices, genocide, and mass human rights violations of missing and disappeared children. The apologies to date aim to limit legal liability. They perpetuate settler amnesty and a culture of impunity. New apologies must be issued that create a full and accurate record of the historical injustices, and they must commit to providing substantive reparations and actions in accordance with international human rights law. Canada also has international obligations to ensure that Canadians learn about and remember the history of the Indian residential school system, not only through education in schools and universities, but in public history institutions and through public commemoration. To date, there has been no holistic and comprehensive legal and policy framework for commemoration that is consistent with international legal principles, that respects Indigenous laws, oral histories, and memory practices. National commemoration and memory laws are needed. Survivors and communities have been the target of denialism and violence. Any attempt to deny or minimize the genocide and crimes against humanity that have been perpetrated against Indigenous children and communities is an attack on the memory of those lost, is hateful, and a continuation of the genocidal process. The federal government must therefore amend the criminal code, making it an offense to willfully promote hate against Indigenous peoples by condoning, denying, downplaying, or justifying the Indian residential school system, or by misrepresenting facts relating to it. As I have already stated, the federal government has adopted a de facto, unlimited, unconditional, blanket self-amnesty, a settler amnesty, to evade accountability at the international and domestic level. This has created and maintained a culture of institutional and individual impunity perpetrated by racist settler colonial beliefs and attitudes about Indigenous people. The importance of combating impunity cannot be overstated. In Canada, settler amnesty and a culture of impunity has impeded accountability and justice for survivors, Indigenous families, and communities. These children died while in the care and custody of the Canadian state. I urge the federal government to now honor its legal, moral, and ethical obligations in accordance with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, international laws, and international human rights law, and to implement all 42 obligations identified in this final report. All the missing respected and treated with the dignity that they deserve. Every child matters in life and in death. I now ask Minister Virani to please come up on stage to receive a copy of the final report and to provide remarks on behalf of the federal government. Now
Kwe, Unasakut, Tanshi, Bonjour, Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. I appreciate that this important day was started in ceremony and solemn acknowledgement of the children who've never come home to their families. It's an honor to be at this gathering, to be joined by my colleague in Parliament, the Honourable Gary Anandasangri, the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, as well as fellow parliamentarians. Let me begin by sincere words of thanks. First, I want to thank Kimberly Murray. Ms. Murray, you've pursued your mandate with dedication and with passion. In doing so, you've helped raise our collective consciousness about the truth of what happened at residential schools and related institutions. As your mandate comes to its end, I want to wish you much success in your new role as National Scholar in Indigenous Legal Studies at Queen's University. Je remercie aussi l'équipe. Je remercie aussi l'équipe du bureau de l'interlocutrice spéciale indépendante et toutes les personnes qui ont facilité la tenue de cette réunion. Merci aussi au gouvernement des Premières Nations, des Inuits et des Métis, aux organisations représentant les personnes autochtones et aux communautés dont beaucoup sont ici aujourd'hui. But most importantly, I want to say thank you to the survivors and the families of children who never came home for sharing your truths, your knowledge, and your experiences. Today, I've received the Special Interlocutor's final report. This is the culmination of 2 years of tireless and emotional work to address the incredibly harmful legacy of residential schools in our country. Ms. Murray's task was daunting in its scope and daunting in its time frame. But I believe there are 2 key aspects that were critical in helping her carry out her work so effectively. First, the interlocutor's mandate was developed in close collaboration with Indigenous leadership and experts. In fact, the idea of this role originated with them. This is significant, and we are forever grateful for their contribution. Second, Ms. Murray has performed her functions independently, according to her own skill and judgment, without any influence from the federal government. This was embedded into her mandate and has been instrumental in allowing her to build trust with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities, and to ensure a process that is Indigenous-led, trauma-informed, and respectful. For that reason, the final report is being released concurrently to all of us today. I know all of us will be reading its contents and recommendations with great interest and great attention. That said, Ms. Murray and her team have already taken important steps toward justice and healing for all of those impacted by residential schools. À travers 6 rassemblements nationaux et des multiples autres réunions et forums, ils ont permis aux personnes qui ont survécu, à leurs familles et à leur communauté de communiquer leur expérience et leur expertise sur les sépultures anonymes, la localisation des documents utiles, l'accès à ces documents et la lutte contre le déni et bien plus. Les rapports intermédiaires de Mme Murray ont aussi favorisé le dialogue sur la voie de l'avenir, notamment le rapport de juin 2023 intitulé « Responsabilité sacrée, la recherche des enfants disparus et des sépultures anonymes » et plus récemment le rapport « Lieu de vérité, lieu de conscience ». Now it is time for our government to carefully review this final report. And I thank you for the presentation you've just done, Ms. Murray, in terms of outlining its contours. But it's time for us to carefully review this report and its recommendations to consider how we move forward together. This work will take time and cooperation among Indigenous, federal, and provincial governments, communities, and religious institutions, among others. While today's gathering marks a closure in some ways, it is by no means an ending. It is a milestone, instead, in our ongoing efforts to address the intergenerational trauma of residential schools. Ensemble, nous allons continuer notre travail commun en vue de refaçonner nos bases, d'honorer les enfants disparus, les personnes qui ont survécu et les familles, et en vue de veiller à ce que les voix autochtones ne soient plus jamais réduites au silence. Together, we will continue to work together to reshape our foundation, to honor missing children, survivors, and families, and to ensure that Indigenous voices are never silenced again. Miigwech, Nyahweh, Nakumik, merci. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
McGregor from the Gittigan ZB Algonquin Nation to come forward.
I have to take a deep breath today, and especially this afternoon. I was going to say, Quake Kana, ing Fred Combonation McGregor, ing an Indigenous cause, ing Omao Mion and Yakir and Ondanaki, ing Getiganzi being Donjaba. And I also like to give you the greetings of Kwe, Sego, Wache, Tanse, and Nani Bojo. I am an Algonquin here from the area which you hear is unceded, and it has a history. There's a shared history where we are in Ottawa, or what they call Ottawa. And what you hear today is history. And my name is Fred Combonation McGregor, and is the one who lands. And that's the on my dad's side. I too, like everybody else, have a history in terms of day school and residential school in my community. And sitting with every one of you here, I am in really good company because we've been wounded. We've been wounded by what happened to an Abnojishnanik, what happened to our children. Children across the north and to the south, and also to the south of the border of the 49th parallel. We share a history of our stolen and murdered children. But one of the things that makes us different here is, for all of the survivors, every one of you that's here, is that it's a collective memory. And that collective memory is what brings us here today and what brings us to these reports. It's for every one of you, the survivors. Some of you in families, you're the sole single member when all of your other family members have disappeared or have been murdered or have died in the residential school. For every one of you here, that part of that collective memory within your family and extended and nuclear family, you tell that story of what happened. And that's a big responsibility. But also to share that responsibility is a considerable emotional, physical, mental, and spiritual process. And I applaud every one of you that you have that strength to be able to do that. When you first started, you were shaky, you cried, you remembered. But as you did it more often, you got stronger. But also, one of the things that you did is you give those children, our children, that voice to say what happened to them. You gave them that voice, and this is the process that here is happening. And one of the things that are happening here is we are history. Our interlocutor here, very strong woman, just outlined the legal part. She said that with strength. But there is one part that you rarely see, and it's a really tough one for her, because in 2020, she was asked to be the interlocutor for this process. And one of the things I was requested is to do an acknowledgement, and I remember this definitely. It was at the Lord Elgin Hotel in a bunch of media. And when I saw Kimberly Murray, there was something that I felt about her. She had that strength. And when I knew what she was doing, it kind of made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, because I know what she was going to look at. And it wasn't going to be an easy job. And I didn't know what to say. But there is one thing, when I looked at her, she says, from Ganezadage. When I did the greeting, there's a word in there, Sego. Sego is Mohawk. And on my mom's and dad's side, especially on my dad's side, there's a shared history. There's a Loka shared history. And when I did the greetings of those four others, it's a large language family, but it also shared history with the Mohawk families. When I knew she was from Gunnesadagi and is also a woman, and one of the things I saw is when you look at every one of the Tekanogans in the back here, and you see the chair, the small, very small chair, and some of you, I've seen some of you have those little suitcases. I've seen Tony, I've seen Eddie, and I've seen others. Some of them have showed me those numbers. But when I look behind and you see all of the Tekanogans, each of those Tekanogans are carried by family members, and especially the women, the water carriers. And some of those have straps on them. And that baby was held very tight and closely. And one of the things I saw in 2020 when that had straps, and when I saw her that first year, she put it on and she stood upright. And she did it proudly. And she accepted. 2 years. Just recently, in May of this year, I seen her again at Knowing History. She did an update when she accepted that position and the work to be done with the team. And she was a presentation with Tanya Talaga. Tanya was looking for her relatives that had died in the residential school process, and it worked together. But when I saw her the second time, I saw the strain and the stress of Kimberly. And what she had on her back, Imaji Bimwene, when she put that on, she carried that responsibility. And when I saw her not too long ago, for that brief and that update and getting close to the report, she was almost stooped over. She was not now carrying a cradle board, but she was carrying a thump line, and she had to be bent forward. Why? Because in the work that she's done, she sees and seen what are done to those children, and what some of us kind of knew but never verified and kind of guessed. She looked at those, she's seen those, she read the records, she's seen the pictures. And the real challenge with this completion of this report, it all started with the apology, it started with the TRC and it gathered strength, but with this one, that when the number 215 did now in the Canadian public eye seriously look, and it was said we're looking for little bodies and little anomalies of little children starting at 5 years old. Did everybody take notice of the previous reports, the start of the TRC, relook at the apology? This is something that Kimberly and her team has taken upon themselves. And it's not an easy task, but it was done one way of Wijinishnabeman. It was taken on with our elders, our grandmothers, our grandfathers. And we lost generations. But those little anomalies have a voice. They've given a voice in this report. And one of the things is, read it. You're going to cry, but you've cried enough. We have that resiliency, and we see where the shortfalls are in Canadian law and the rule of law, where we're excluded or we're not included, etc. We see Peter Irnick, where he said, I was kidnapped. Then you see Pakak Pico in the video, where some of them are buried. But there's a difference. In the youth, there's Megan Metz. What Megan Metz stated is a Heisler of what happened to our children. That's the generation that is going to make this difference and change this whole process. She is not asking, she is getting that education. And you could see that confidence. It was told by several national chiefs ago that when some of this started, I think there was one national chief that had said about the youth, is that the next generation, past my generation, my son's generation, is that generation is not going to ask. They're going to take it and they're going to do it. And hearing the confidence in Megan's voice is the reports that everyone should be reading. And everyone in Canada, we have an issue of denialism. We just have to look at south of the border. Denialism has already started. And it's brutal. But they don't know our history. We are history. We are the history even before Canada, and we are Canada's history. But we are not Canadian Indians. We were the original. It was done on our lands, and if we did not surrender our lands, we know what was done to our children. There is a denial of genocide, but when you look at it, it is what it is. So these are the things that we have to sit down. When our residential school survivors did that, as hard as it is, they told us and are telling us, and they're telling the next generation. This is something that is not easy, but if we can admit to it, and if we can do the changes, this is what's needed. Canada has some really severe changes that it has to admit to. So for the elders that are here, and our gokoms and our mishos, miigwech gigibad nisi egon shema ne gigibad mach be kayen to wach ne abno jishna ne gon shema guch. For the elders, the kokoms, and the mishos, for those of you that are here and had made it here, I thank you for telling the stories, as hard as it is. You have that strength to do that. Because one of the things today is we lit the sacred fire. We lit the kulik. We started to hear the Inuit stories. We've smudged these reports, because why we smudge those reports, in every one of those pages there are stories. And those spirits are here in this room and in this gathering. And this is something that Canada and the world has to hear. Until Kamloops, nobody cared. But now people are looking at Canada and its reputation. We look what's happening around the world. We look what's happening in the Strip. We see what happened to the children. And Canada says that doesn't happen here. It did happen very early. And it disappeared. Nobody disappears in Canada. Well, fortunately, just what Kimberly has. So those is what I say to Kimberly. I say miigwech. And one of the things is, in the Anishinaabe understanding, is that also There are elder women here. I don't know if we'll be able to do it or it's going to be done, but there is, because the completion of this report is that we brush down Kimberly and the team of women and the team of men that assisted in this. That now that they can take off some of that responsibility, instead of bending over with a tump line and walking very hard, that they can stand upright and they can take that off because you have done your responsibility. This is needed because we absolve her of her responsibilities. I would like everyone to stand up. Debout, s'il vous plaît. Kimberly, I'd like you to come forward. I would like you to stand in front of the chair, in front of the display. And everyone in the audience, I want to hear a round of applause for her. Because for all the writers of that report, you had to see what Kimberly has seen. Kimberly had to do two sides. But the reporters of all the writers, you had to carefully write that at the same time, and which is a real challenge. You saw the real guts, but also to write it so that it's the way it is, so that government will understand, but not have that kind of emotion, but to put enough emotion into it. So I'd like to hear for all of the writers as well, the writers of the report, I would like to hear a I don't know when. It's coming. And what the brush down is, it's going to be with a feather, and it's to help the spiritual, physical, emotional, and mental of what they've gone through. It's releasing some of that energy that she's had to take upon herself. And one of the things that it still continues to this day, as to what Kimberly mentioned about the disappearing. I had a dad that since passed, and he had a little sister that died on the trap line. And it's in the town of Maniwaki, and one of the things that's happened in history, because they moved the gate and they didn't bother to record it. But he remembered roughly where. So to this day, that still continues. For example, in Quebec, when the TRC report was written, it was politely accepted in French. The report was kindly shelved, and it was told that it's not a provincial thing. In Quebec, il y a des pensionnats. There is that history. There's the Innu, Naskapi, Algonquin. All of us, this is not done like the way it's done in other provinces of being told. These are still of the realities, and it's only being taught in schools, but only in certain areas in certain provinces. Montreal, it's done in the core, but the rest of the province is not done. What's interesting, it says in Quebec, they say, well, there is racism. We are racist like everybody else, but we are not systemic. reason it's convenient is because Jordan's principle will not apply. Because there has, in there, it says that there has to be proven of systemic racism. And this is one of the reasons it says systemic doesn't, we're not systemic. So this is what we deal with. This is what we have to teach each other, because we did not deny the visitors. And it's still a land issue. And these are some of the things we deal with. So hopefully you get a chance to appreciate that as well. You'll come back to it. You may only read a section, but you will come back to it, and there's more to come. What's happened is we heard south of the border last Friday. We had the apology here many years ago because we were the original people of Mi'kmaq-Minitig. We still have a pope that still will not apologize. Apologized in South America, but didn't apologize to North America. Those are the realities, and our children still have those challenges. So we're going to do the brush down.
Nice to see old friends, new friends. I'd like to say a prayer before we start. Don't remember where I got this prayer, but it's stuck in my head. The prayer is,
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Elder Fred McGregor. And Elder Thelma Nelson, who had performed the brushdown ceremony. Thank you. I would like to now call upon Sylvia Cloutier to end this ceremony with a song and to bring her drum to again remind us of our Mother Earth's heartbeat. Sylvia?
I was asked to share a song for this important event. I want to say that I'm very happy in many ways to see everyone coming together to heal. I want to honor all those young people who lost their lives, and also their parents who grieves for them. I also want to honor our young people today who are working really hard at trying to survive, at living their lives, doing their very best. And some young people all over the country, Indigenous children, Indigenous teenagers, and young adults, they're doing amazing things. And I think it's really important to remember that. Everyone's doing their best in the best way they know how. And we all deserve to be loved. And we all deserve to be healthy. This song expresses pride as a young person, as a young Inuk. Inuk means person. Inuit means human beings, people. Being proud to be alive, that we come from very strong people and a beautiful land. Let our young people lead the way into healing too. Inuin sivunik sangat makutuvunga upi mavunga nunagiyavun kacanak tualu sanginikang man inusiriyaw lakdu ayaya 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 Inuit sivunik sangan makutuvunga upi mavunga nunahiyavun kacanak tualu sanginikang man hinusiriyaw lakdu ayaya 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 You are welcome to sing along, because singing is also very healing. And all the things that you are grateful for in life, you can sing. McCormick.
Sylvia Cloutier, ladies and gentlemen. As we come to the end of this presentation ceremony, I just want to remind folks that there are 4 interactive breakout sessions that will begin at 3:15 p.m. to recap. In session 1, Survivor Sharing Circle, National Center for Truth and Reconciliation is located in the Suzar Cote room. There will be 3 healing sessions led by the Knowledge Keepers, one by the Sacred Fire located out on the terrace, another in room Deflost, and the last one right here in the theater. If you need assistance, volunteers will assist you. You can also go visit our health and wellness supports who are in room Julien and Gagnon, as well as the Elders Lounge in Salon des Jardins. Reports are available as you exit the theater. Please take one. And a reminder as well that dinner is back in the main ballroom at 6 p.m. We'll see you all there. Miigwech, thank you. Merci beaucoup.